Yeah, so hopefully get through this quick, but we're going to do a little bit on the logic of ought. Then we're going to talk about obligation. So so this is the Onus and Ought by Mahrad, Almotahari, and Rabern. Forthcoming analysis. Apologize how I say your names. I'm pathetic outside of very boring English. But yeah, so here we go. And as always, anyone out there still watching, I know the other one was a bit of a slog. Thank you for being here still, and ask questions if you are interested. Let me know. 1. Obligations are requirements, and requirements are necessities. Naturally, then, obligations are necessities. This compelling syllogism provides an important clue to the logic of obligation. It's simply the logic of necessity suitably restricted. Okay. There are lots of things that are in logic nowadays that are, go by necessity. And so the idea that like obligations are necessities, it's like, well, there's modal logic of which is generally the logic of necessity, and there's deontic logic, which is straight up the logic of obligations. And so the idea that it's a syllogism is like, yeah, sure, but we've got much more powerful things than the syllogistic nowadays. But like, yeah, so let's see. Okay, here we go. Fortunately, the logic of necessity is well understood. If we interpret the standard notation of modal logic in the appropriate way, letting box abbreviate it ought to be that, and diamond it is permissible that, then we fiddle around with our Kripke models to formulate a complementary semantic theory. That's from Montague, 1960. This goes back to just showing off my pathetic knowledge of history. Is Georg von Richt in the 50s really developed deontic logic, and then later when Kripke came around, that got adapted into our Kripke models. I think that's how it went. Don't sue me if I'm wrong. Incorporating familiar tools for the representation of context sensitivity, specifically a modal base and an ordering source, enables the logic to serve as a semantic theory for a rich and philosophically interesting fragment of natural languages. Kratzer, 2012. This precision and uniformity of this approach, coupled with its empirical successes over several decades of fruitful research, offers a powerful reason to think that little more is required. Perhaps we should expect some fine-tuning here and there, but future revisions will preserve the foundational assumption that the grammar and meaning of ought is a special case of the grammar and meaning of box. And Box's metaphysical necessity, saying like all possible universes should be this way. Portner and Chrisman call this the standard theory of deontic modals. To avoid equivocation, boxes and diamonds are often reserved for the expression of alethic modalities. Yeah, that's true and false things. Deontic necessity is usually expressed with an O for ought or obligation. Consequently, the structure implicit in 1 is made explicit in 1 star. So 1 is nobody ought to die of hunger, and 1 star is O, which is it's an obligation that nobody dies of hunger. Yeah, so they moved, basically what they did was they moved this ought to, you move it to the outside here. And because it's governing how we should feel about this, and that's nobody dies of hunger, and that's something we all ought to do. A sentence of the form O phi is true and at a context if and only if the relevant domain of possible worlds in that context, roughly speaking, the modal base, is such that in all the highest ranked worlds relative to the operative standards in that context, that is the ordering source, phi is true. This is basically saying, look, if you're taking all the possible ideas that you have of like that are not crazy, and that's how the world is, then it's true in that context. Like, I mean, we're not talking about like aliens coming down and changing things, but we're saying like all the ones that are like not crazy ideas, then you're going to call that true. The simplicity of this analysis is attractive, but its scope is controversial. There's an undercurrent of dissatisfaction stemming from the sense that ought, as a propositional operator, is most apt for expressing how things ought to be, not what someone ought to do. Really? I mean, like, I mean, the scope is controversial. Sure, I guess that's controversial. I mean, I don't know this literature, so like, all right, so they got a bunch of links here, but not links, but references to say that like people are actually worried about this. But you can switch out the scope easily. That's not a problem. Anyway, continuing. Numerous challenges suggest, in various ways, that the standard theory misses something important about how obligation is related to a particular agent. And they got a whole lot more to say in the footnotes here. Some ought statements don't just say how things ought to be. They also seem to indicate where the onus to act lies. Can the standard theory do justice to the representation of onus in ought statements? An author says, no, it can't. This raises a puzzle about the direction of future theorizing. 2. Our central question is suggestive but perhaps not sufficiently clear. We'll try to bring it into sharper focus with an example. 2. John ought to kiss Mary. 2-star obligation. John kisses Mary. Sentence 2 attributes an obligation to John and thereby establishes a basis for him holding him accountable. If equivalently, it places the onus on him to kiss Mary. The most salient reading of 3, however, is neutral with respect to where the onus lies. 3. Mary ought to be kissed by John. 3-star obligatory. Mary is kissed by John. So what are we saying? Neutral with who needs to be kissed. Mary ought to be kissed by John. Mary is kissed by John. Yeah, but like you could fix this in the logic if that's what you meant. Just pulling. See, the problem here is just pulling the ought out to the front is not very sophisticated way to read the sentence. Like, no one said that just having the same sense is going to always mean the same thing. And this is one of the problems with compositionality of logic, is that clearly this to be is changing the logic here, and because it's not the same up here. It's not. It just says ought to kiss Mary and ought to be kissed by John. This is here is very different. And so the fact that when you change the sentence this way, why would you think that turning a word into a logical operator is always going to work the same way? It doesn't. And so this is really not a problem with like the logic here. It's, I think, how we're interpreting like that the sentence obviously lines up with the logic. That's not always the case, and there's many examples where this doesn't happen. You can, all that glitters is gold. These are logic 101 examples where all that glitters is gold. Well, maybe not 101, but logic, undergraduate logic, where you have to say all that glitters is not gold. You have to use a existential quantifier, not a universal quantifier, even though you're saying all in the sentence. And so like the English does not always line up with the formalization. There's things called donkey sentences where it's just like extremely difficult to get it to all line up correctly. There's lots of weird ones, but like this is the thing. And so when you try to read, this is one of my bugaboos. When you try to read the logic off the English, you have to interpret. You have to know what's being said first, and not just naively move naively not just plug in the logical operators where they appear in the English, because that's not always what sentences mean. Because you've got different things, like when you've got this to be kissed by construction is not the same when you take other words out of the sentence. Okay. Anyway, the author says, perhaps John has promised his wife that he won't kiss Mary, in which case he would have an obligation to refrain from doing so. Still, you might think that Mary deserves to be kissed by John. After all, she won the competition, and the prize, we were all told, would be a kiss from John. It would be unjust if Mary isn't given what she's owed. So it ought to be that Mary is kissed by John. The difference between 2 and 3, as John ought to kiss Mary and Mary ought to be kissed by John, indicates that they express different contents, but their respective analyses, according to the standard theory, appear to be equivalent since 1, the embedded senses appear to be equivalent, and 2, the univocality of O is baked into the standard theory. Yes and no. The way you schematize things, like I just said, with all that glitters is not gold, it's not. That's the standard theory. There is to just like, you can't just use an a universal quantifier just because it says all in the English, and that's the same thing here. Just moving the ought out front and like fixing up the grammar as like minimally as you need to is like, that's, I just think, lazy logic. Like, why are you doing that? You have to understand what's being said, the sentence says, and then you can schematize it. You can't just like, oh, this is what it's on the page, and then just move stuff out. What? Oh, thank you, Twix, for reminding me that you've made some crappy feature that nobody wanted. Okay. All right. So it's interesting. So they're saying some have abandoned the view for this reason, because they don't understand that you can't just compositionality for logic is more complicated than people realize. This is a big problem overall, not just in this area. There are ought claims that might be analyzed in the standard way as a propositional operator combined with a declarative sentence, but for onus attributing ought statements, new technology is required. A simple idea would be to index the propositional operator to the different agents, so obligation of A phi as opposed to obligation B phi, that's OA phi versus OB phi. Or one might rely on a two-place relation between an agent and a proposition, so then we've got OA phi versus OB phi. It's just I doubt you can see it on the page. It's just a notational difference, using parentheses or using subscripts. Alternatively, one might opt for a relation between an agent and an act type, or an agent and a property, or an agent and a centered proposition. These differences don't matter for our purposes. What matters is that these are all ways of moving away from the standard theory. For now, our interest lies in whether there's good reason to undertake this movement, not in the specific direction it might lead. The contrast between 2 and 3 doesn't by itself undermine the standard theory. One could question the assumption that the embedded sentences are equivalent, or that they're equivalent on the intended readings. One very natural reading of John kissed Mary is agential. That is, kissing Mary is something that John is said to have done. It's not something that is merely said to have happened to him. A natural reading of Mary was kissed by John, however, is non-agential. Kissing Mary is something that's merely said to involve John by accident. If the kissing is an action that John performs at all, then it was an unintentional action. Given this intuitive contrast, the standard theorist might insist that the embedded sentences in 2 and 3 are at most equivalent on a disambiguation. One standard framework in which this contrast can be represented is STIT theory, that's of Belknap and Perloff 88. The acronym STIT stands for the phrase sees to it that, and that one of the central ideas motivating the framework is that the difference between agential and non-agential readings is broadly a matter of logic. So there must be a formal difference between the embedded sentences about John and Mary, one that we can represent with the phrase X sees to that, or STIT sub X. According to the STIT theory on the relevant disambiguation, the embedded sentence in 2 instantiates the form given in 2 double star. The embedded sentence in 3 exemplifies a structure in 3 double star. So 2 says STIT sub J KJM, and 3 is just no STIT KJM. The formal difference between 2 double star and 3 double star is supposed to reflect the semantic distinction between the agential readings of the NP-VP constructions and their non-agential counterparts. Note that 2 double star implies 3 double star, but not vice versa. The difference between 2 double star and 3 double star is basically the difference between intentional and unintentional actions. So yeah, like if John kissed Mary versus Mary was kissed by John, and somehow Mary was kissed by John does not imply that John did the kissing, just that he was there when they were kissing. In 3, that is. Other frameworks explain the semantic difference between 2 and 3 differently. According to the contrastivist approach of Finlay and Snedegar, and 2 and 3 differ because they contextually invoke different contrast classes. 2 is true just in case it ought to be that John kisses Mary rather than John kisses Alice, or that John kisses Bernadette. I mean, just it's funny. Like, I'm annoyed with this stuff. I'm like, why can't you have John kissing another, like Michael? Like, why are we doing heteronormative logic here, jerk faces? Because the agent John remains constant in each case. 2 is agential. 3, however, is true just in case it ought to be that John kisses Mary rather than Calvin kisses Mary, or that Dwight kisses Mary, because the agent varies. 3 is non-agental. Our summary of Sith theory and contrastivism indicates how resourceful the standard theory is. So you might think the answer to our central question, can the standard theory do justice to the representation of Onus in odd statements, is yes. But there's a more powerful challenge in the often. Our aim is to present it and explain why it matters. I mean, again, like I was saying, we have to understand what the sentences mean. If we were just going to read off the logic from the structure of the English, then yeah, you're going to run into trouble because people use our words in very complicated ways. Screw you, the ads are back on. Thanks, Twitch. But yeah, like we can't just like assume that the logical form is going to follow the form of the English. And of course, there are going to be other theories that pick out different parts of the English. But again, I'm on the thing that you have to understand what is meant before you can actually start applying theories to it. It's like if you don't understand what it means, you're going to find a one case somewhere that is different from all the other cases you've considered. And then, like, well, you're applying all these theories that have not yet understood the sentence. All right, so continuing. 3. The challenge begins with an influential principle from ancient Greek ethics. It's better to be wronged by another person than to wrong them. Alternatively, one ought to be wronged by another person rather than wrong them. Okay, that's 4. The basic idea is that wronging someone is ultimately damaging to oneself, and the damage to one's character well-being is so costly that one ought to endure a wronging rather than be its agent. I mean, I gotta think there's something of scale here. How bad do you have to, like, get hurt before you say, well, it would have been better if I was just being a jerk a little bit? Perhaps that's why Christ recommended that his followers turn the other cheek, and why Gandhi practiced satyagraha. Satyagraha? Apologize for how I say that. The idea seems to resonate across various times and cultures, and a familiar conception of the relationship between character and well-being seems to lie behind it, a conception that students encounter in Plato's Republic, according to which the soul of an unjust person is in turmoil. In other words, immorality is deeply incompatible with human flourishing. Yeah, people say that, but I mean, it doesn't look like anyone actually gave a shit over the course of history. A lot of crappy people seem to do really well. So, yeah. I mean, people think this, but like, there's less evidence that it actually holds. Arguing for, and that's this thing saying basically, don't get hurt. It's better to be injured than to do the injuring. Arguing for 4 would be a monumental undertaking and not one that we're able to attempt. Fortunately, our argument doesn't require that 4 be true, only that it only requires that it be deontically coherent. Well, maybe it is. I don't know about that. And we trust that its role in the history of philosophy demonstrates that much. Yeah, I mean, that's fair. That people have said this before. Again, I don't think it applies to actual humans, but people have said that in the history of philosophy. More precisely, we assume nothing from the form o phi and not o not phi. So you're obligated to phi and not. Whoa, 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 whoa. This is not how I would schematize this, because phi is directed like you are harming somebody versus someone harming you. So that's not what a negation is doing here. That's not it at all. So this is a consequence of 4. What's phi? They didn't even define phi here. How can you do this? For what it's worth, they say when we discuss 4 with friends and colleagues, no one expresses a worry to the effect that it imposes unsatisfiable demands. One ought. Yeah, I don't have any problem with 4. I have what the flying, like literally, what the flying fuck is this? Like what, how does 4 imply that thing? I don't understand that. Because, yeah, like this doesn't make sense. One ought to be wronged by another person rather than wrong them. What, how is this like even, how does 4 get to this? Like, I don't even understand. Obligate phi and obligate not phi. You're obligated to do something, you're obligated to not do something. What does this, oh my god. Oh my god. Like, seriously? All right, maybe they won't matter. Like, I'm just hoping it won't matter. I don't understand that sentence. Maybe I'm missing something. Now, assume for simplicity that rather than is a binary sentence connective. Okay, yeah, because like I don't see how we're getting from here to here, but maybe they're going to show us how to derive this apparently contradictory thing that you're obligated to do something and obligated to not do something from the sentence that does not say that. Okay, so assume for simplicity that rather than is a binary sentence connective, so phi is greater than psi. So you'd rather phi than psi. How then does it interact with ought? An example will help. 5. Sam ought to finish his homework rather than go out all night. So you're obligated, so Sam finish homework rather than go out all night. I already dislike this because the way connectives work this is not entirely how connectives work. Like, again, where does the ought actually go? Because ought to finish his homework rather than go out all night. You could write instead here, the obligation is actually here. So he's obligated to finish his homework rather than going out all night. So you could actually have the scope difference here. So it's like the obligation only talks about him doing his homework as opposed to going out all night. So I don't know if like this schematization is exactly accurate already. But it does make sense. It says Sam ought to, like, so finishing homework is more important than going out all night. I think that's reasonable, but like you could already start futzing with this. So according to standard theory, 5 is true only if among the worlds where Sam either finishes his homework or goes out all night, Sam finishes his homework is in the highest ranked worlds. More generally, so yeah, okay. Phi is greater than psi is true if and only if among the phi or psi worlds in the relevant domain, the highest ranked worlds are phi worlds, not psi worlds. So the standard theory yields the following analysis of 4. For any x, for any y, and x is not equal to y, implies that you're obligated to yx is greater than to xy. So it's basically saying you're obligated to do one, all those worlds are better where you do one first than the other first, where these two things are not equal. But they claim that 4 is incoherent. Why? This becomes apparent when we consider two of its immediate consequences. We assume that A and B are distinct agents. So obligation WBA is greater than WAB, and then you just switch it around. According to 6, the standard theory, 6 is true only if among the WAB or WBA worlds, the highest ranked ones are WBA worlds and not WAB worlds, but likewise 7 is true if the very same worlds, highest ranked worlds, are flipped. Thus, 4 star is true only if some world is ranked higher than itself. This is therefore contradictory. How are 6 and 7 implied from 4? The fact that you can imply A and B, like you can instantiate this sentence twice to two different things, and then you could get like x equals B first and then y equals A, and then you could do it again to the other way around. That has nothing to do with anything. Like, I don't understand. Like, you can instantiate things to being the opposite things. For any x, for any y, if they're not the same, yeah, you can switch it. But the problem is you'd have to instantiate them to, like, you'd have to, copy this over, say, and then this whole thing here, like, 4 star again. So we got 4 star. So this is 4 star. So we're doing this twice. We have the same sentence twice, and you instantiate it to the two things. And that's what they're doing, basically. So the question is that a legitimate move? Yes, I guess so. I'm trying to think. You could probably, yeah, now the question is, can we get this, like this statement here out of this actually? I'm not even so sure. So you're saying of all the worlds, there's one thing that's better than the other thing. This is saying there's a well ordering on all the obligations, and that's fair. But like, I think that's wrong. You can't always well order all the obligations in the universe because you're going to have conflicting obligations. And maybe that's basically what they're saying right here. But then again, how did you get that from the idea that he could only do there was one thing that was better than another? So like the fact that there's conflicting obligations, and then if you don't specify that there's always a well ordering to the obligations, I mean, that's not new. I'm trying to think, where are we getting this 4-star from? The analysis of 4. Where's 4? One ought to be wronged by another person rather than wrong them. Okay, so they're saying this, that there's always an ordering based on a wronging then. Does saying that you're... So here's the question. Does saying that there's always an ordering to being wronged by, does that well order all obligations in some very weak sense that like there's you could be treating someone always better in a certain way? Probably. All right, I see what they're doing. They're basically, but like again, this is not a new argument that obligations are not well ordered. You can always do things that are like, it's not clear that there is a well ordering on all the goodness in the world and things to be done. And they're bringing that out here, but the jumping from this to this, I mean, is, I think, excessive. Because you're basically saying wronged, and there's always an ordering on wronging. And then you're going to also say, all right, well, then you can switch around. Well, of course, this is like always being wronged this way is better than being wronged another way. But again, the idea that everything is going to be ordered by this wronging relation is excessive. So yeah, so this is what they're doing. So thus 4-star is true only if some world is ranked higher than itself. It is therefore contradictory, but 4 is coherent. And see right there, if you go back and you look at what was actually done, moving from 4 to 4-star, I don't think it is, because what they're doing is they're putting a giant ordering in 4, and they're saying that's coherent. It's probably not, or it doesn't have the scope required for universal generalization, which is what they're doing here. They're generalizing to everything over being wronged by, basically. That like universally, that applies universally to all things. So I mean, yeah, but like, what is the scope of this universal generalization here in obligation? So again, where is the universal thing? One ought to be wronged by another person rather than to wrong them. So it would be saying there exists something that you would rather be than to be wronged by someone else. So that'd be the exist X, wronged by another person, then wrong them, then I exist rather than I wrong them. And that for all things, yeah, like what? But to be wronged by is the problem here, I guess. And that's it. This is the rather. Not the rather. It's the wronged by is the scope. Being wronged by someone does not cover all obligations. And so right here, wronged by, I mean, they're generalizing the obligations of everything into this one wronged by thing. And that seems odd, because then they can place in anythings to be wronged by. And that's weird. Because like what you're going to do is you can be like, I can't wrong him, I can't wrong her, I can't wrong her. And then eventually you're going to get to everybody. And you could put your, so you can make a circle. You can make a cycle on this. And that's kind of what's happening. Because A wrongs B and B wrongs C. And then C can then go wrong A or something. So that's how the logic on these things run. But yeah. Okay. So, yeah, but 4 is coherent. It certainly feels like wisdom. Yeah, see, that's true. They're not going to press the point. We won't press the point. All that matters is that a principle as influential to the history of ethics as 4 shouldn't be made incoherent by development of formal semantics. It didn't. It was made incoherent by your doing a giant scope expansion on being wronged by, which, of course, you don't see in this thing because you've put it into... you've gotten rid of it basically. There is no wronged by. This is W here. Doesn't make any sense in terms of for anything that anyone is doing. Okay. Note that 4 is explicitly contrastive in form and the problem issues from the logical consequences of 4 star. These elements of the argument bar a potential resource for the standard theorists to exploit, a la Finlay and Snedegar, namely contextually supplied contrast classes and Gricean pragmatics. Furthermore, sprinkling into stit operators to highlight the locus of the agential reading also doesn't help capture the intended interpretation. Yeah, but like this is the problem again. One ought to be wronged by another person rather than to wrong them. But like, again, how is it that like, for any X, any Y, and they're not the same person, one ought to be one ought to prefer to be wronged by another person than to wrong them. And then you can swap it around, because if the other person would say the same thing, and then it would be thing. But again, that's it. There's an existential in here. They're not saying in the hypothetical, because none of this exists, and so this is the problem. This may not exist. There may be no. This thing may never exist. There is no existential quantifier. They're quantifying into these things without saying this actually occurs. There may never be a time when X does not equal Y. Well, I mean, you can of course do it. This is vacuous. This could be a vacuously true statement. So that's one thing here. Yeah, because if you did exist X and exist Y, there would be if they weren't the same. Yeah, see, this may be the problem, is that they're using universal quantifiers here instead of existential ones. And then once you use existential quantifiers, there's actually rules against reinstantiating with the same variables, which happens right here. So if you're getting really technical about this stuff, you have to be careful about the variables you've already instantiated into. And so that's exactly what I think happened here, is that they've generalized on being wronged by, but the logical problem here is a very subtle one about existential instantiation. You can't keep picking the same variables. You can do that with universals. You can't keep doing that with existentials, because you get into problems like this. And so I think that's what's going on in this 4 star. Because it's like, you can see, look, if Y is, because wronged by, you can do this with other stuff. This obligation is doing nothing here. It's just like stating that like these things are incompatible, which is fine. But yeah, I think that's actually the logical problem here, is that this is they're using universals when they need to have actual people in this situation, not hypothetical any's. Okay. But alright, there we go. Aficionados will probably notice that our central argument subtly relies on agglomeration. And that's given phi, and if psi then semantically implies, means phi and psi. So, given phi, given psi, then you can make a conjunction of them. That's fine. The standard theory validates this principle, because that's combining these two things to make your problem there. The standard theory validates this principle, but it's sometimes seen as a shortcoming. There are ways of rejecting agglomeration while preserving the foundational architecture of the standard theory. Yeah, you can do anything you damn well please with logic. Like if you want to change like those sort of theories. That's not the problem in this paper. So you might, continuing. So you might ask, doesn't our argument have a limited bearing on the theory's viability? They say no. Even if we abandon agglomeration, 6 and 7 will entail a deontic conflict. That's because O phi is greater than psi implies O not phi, psi is greater than phi. So if Sam ought to finish his homework rather than go out all night, then he oughtn't go out all night rather than finish his homework. So 4 star yields the following: WAB is greater than WBA, and O not WAB greater than WBA. And in the technical terms, this O is called, just from my own nerdiness, it's called factive. It is sort of a factive operator. And you can just drop off the O if you want, then you get a standard. Actually, no, you don't get a yeah, then you get a standard contradiction. Okay, but as they observed at the outset, 4 doesn't commit 1 to a deontic conflict. To be clear, we're not now claiming that deontic conflicts are impossible, only that 4 remains silent about them. Alright, yeah, they're saying 4 is fine, they're just how it's formalized. But again, I think they fucked up in the using universal quantifiers there, because they need an existential for actual people. But I wonder if, like, is that really right, or am I wrong about this? I mean, you should be able to generalize off of Sam that, like, any person ought to not off Sam, by another person. So one ought to be wronged by any other person rather than to be wronged by any other person. But you can see how that sounds kind of weird. Any other person, one ought to be wronged by another person. There exists someone there that you'd be wronged by, then to be wronged by them. And again, that's so if there exists somebody, you shouldn't wrong them. But for anybody, maybe. I don't know. There may be some lingering suspicion that our argument trades on a peculiarity of rather than construction or generic one, and that a more adequate theoretical understanding of these constructions will resolve the difficulty, leaving the standard theory intact. That's what I'm saying. I'm thinking there's a problem with their universal generalization and instantiation. I think it should be existential. Though these expressions raise interesting issues that deserve attention, we think they're dialectically irrelevant here. 3, so they say 8. If a person will either be wronged by another or wrong them, then they ought to be wronged by the other and not wrong them. Yeah. Sentence 8 expresses basically the same moral principle, but without the use of rather than or one. The indefinite person has a universal force akin to a farmer in the more familiar donkey. This is why I said donkey sentences earlier. If a farmer owns a donkey, he beats it. Given 8, the argument against the standard theory would proceed as before, yielding the same conclusion. Yeah. And this is the thing. You need to have like these sort of complex references in the sentence. But again, how this gets... yeah, see, this is... They're arguing has the indefinite... A person has universal force. Here. But like, see, this is wasn't what I was saying. I'm saying they need an existential, not a universal in statement. And I'm saying it with not with respect to rather than. It was with respect to the generalization of the people. Yeah. If a person, the indefinite has the universal force. Yeah. Well, so maybe this is exactly what I was complaining about. Maybe they thought of this. Let's see. Am I wrong about this? If for anyone, they would be wronged by another person. Yeah. I still think there's a problem here. Because I still think these are, should be existentials. So... if there is a person that is wronged by any other person, then they ought to be wronged by the other and not wrong them. Yeah, see, if you do it this way, that's fair, but I'm not sure then we're going to get the exact same thing. Let me think about this for a half sec. If a person will either be wronged by another or wrong them, then they ought to be wronged by the other and not wrong them. Again, we have to instantiate it twice and switch around the things. Now, so then we have this well-ordering of wrongness. And you're using it twice. I still feel like you can't instantiate the same variables over and over. In this sentence. I'm trying to figure out if they're saying... They're claiming it has universal force, but I don't know if it does. So, I'm not sure. they're saying it's like a donkey sense. If a farmer owns a donkey, he beats it. And so in that thing, you have to say if any farmer owns a donkey, then he beats it. Even though the A is usually taken to be a existential. Like if there was a farmer that owned a donkey, he beat it. Okay, but I'm still feeling like this one here, like there should be an existential in there somewhere, and that's what's screwing it. Okay, our challenge then is this: how can the standard theorist accommodate the coherence of both 4 and 8 while maintaining the univocality of ought as an unrelativized operator on declarative senses? We do not say that can't be done, but we do say it isn't obvious how. The problem for the standard theory is that by its lights, the interpretation of the obligation operator is insensitive to the source of its wronging. Source of a wronging. It only cares about how the worlds are ranked. So it shouldn't matter whether A is wronging B or B is wronging A. Either way, there's a wronging. This sort of insensitivity is perfectly fine when one wants to say how circumstances ought to be, but inadequate when one's meaning concerns what one ought to do, where the onus in ought lies. The use of stit and similar devices may help somewhat with this issue, as our brief discussion of passivization suggests, but 4 and 8 are cases where these devices don't help. This diagnosis presents us with a choice. One option is that ought is ambiguous. On one reading, it semantically expresses a relation between agents and actions, or centered worlds, or whatever else. On the other hand, a function from propositions to truth values. This bifurcation of meaning might be formally implemented in various ways, but if ambiguity is the way to go, then 4 or 8 provide linguistic evidence for its acknowledgement. It certainly wasn't clear at the outset that some form of semantic bifurcation would be necessary. As Krisman observes, the only attempt I know of by philosophers sympathetic to this kind of bifurcation to provide linguistic argument for an agentive versus non-agentive distinction in the semantic functioning of the word ought is by Schroeder's 2011. If in the end one opts for ambiguity, the argument that we've offered in this paper vindicates the decision on empirical linguistic grounds. But bifurcation isn't cost-free. If the same pattern is seen to occur cross-linguistically and with other modals, for example with may and can, then positing a brute one-off ambiguity wouldn't carve meaning at the joints. The challenge we've raised here motivates the conclusion that, insofar as we maintain the univocality of ought, the semantics of ought statements must be centered around personal obligation instead of impersonal rankings of circumstances. In a slogan, ought implies onus. Like the ambiguity strategy, this thought can be formally implemented in various ways. But, as before, we won't take a stand on which implementation is the most promising. We'll simply note a lingering question for this approach. If one's account begins with personal obligation, how will one understand the ought to be's that motivated the standard theories? More specifically, how will one analyze ought statements that don't seem to place an onus on anyone in particular? Okay. Not terrible. They got pretty close to what I thought they needed to say to do this, and the idea that there's personal necessities versus global necessities is fair. This, I actually think I agree with them in the end that this is there is a definite problem between between individuals under modal operators. Like this statement right here. Let me change highlighter color. This one right here. This sort of statement is very difficult to actually interpret because the you do lose individuality under modal operators, and that's right. But again, that's a known issue. Now they're saying it shows up here that it's ambiguous who is doing the who has onus, and so that's fair. And so again, if you have a personal necessity, or there is something strictly based on you and not the universe, then that can happen in modal operators. So actually, yeah, I think I agree with this. I'm not sure if that you can futz with the existentials in here to actually force the issue of being individuals differently. So that's what I was saying. You can use different quantifiers. So you can use like the backwards E to have different rules about like how the variables act. But like that's getting subtle stuff, and maybe that's not even like a worthwhile thing to do in this sort of thing. Because if you want it to be a part of your obligation theory, then using a different sort of method isn't exactly the right thing. But of course, if you can just do it in the standard logic, then it's a question of how you schematize it. And if you can schematize it, then they don't have a problem. So, but then the question is, then you have to ask, why are we using E's in the backwards E instead of the upside down A, the existential instead of the universal quantifier? So, let me see. I'm trying to look at all this stuff down here. I'm just looking to see if they actually commented on existentials here. Yeah, because instead of saying for any X, for any Y, you could say for some person, if there exists some person X and there exists some person Y that they're not the same person, then they are obligated not to prefer to be injured than to injure somebody else. But if you have this a bunch of times, then if you're using the existential, you can't really keep using the same variables, depending on your theory of logic, that is. But that's much more complicated. So, yeah. Okay, so I actually agree that you lose specificity under modal operators, and they brought that out in this way. Granted, the idea that you're doing it this way is like, I'm a little worried about that. I was really worried at the beginning of this paper because I was like, what the hell is going on with this? But like, yeah, they did get somewhere, so that's interesting. I think that yeah, see, they were getting to this, and that's just why they were mentioning it up here, that they were going to get a straight up contradiction or something that looks like a straight up contradiction and obligations. And it's like, yeah, that's what that was up there. Let me see if I can think of anything else that I need to say about this. Sam ought to finish his homework rather than go out night. Obligation of one over the other. And then one ought to be wronged by another person rather than wrong them. Yeah, for any person, X and Y, they should prefer to be wronged by the other person. To be wronged than to be the one wronging. Yeah, I mean, I can see why you would say for any person, they ought. Yeah, but see, does that sound right? For any person, they ought to prefer being wronged by another person than to wrong the person. That sounds okay too. You can do that. So the question is this a question of obligation or a question of logic? And the author's just not employing the right thing. And they say down here in the donkey sentence in 8, if a person, yeah. More principle rather than or one, yeah. So I'm just not sure actually about I mean, it does seem like this is the right in terms of 8 in terms of a donkey sentence. If a person will either be wronged by another or wrong them, then they ought to be wronged by the other and not wrong them. Yeah. obligation, wrong X, Y, and then X. Yeah, so it's like as soon as you have like more than 4 people, as soon as you have more than 2 people, well, more than one person, then for each person they should be wronging each other. The problem is that none of them necessarily will ever wrong each other, and so this doesn't actually. This is my problem with the existential. That's what it is. If no one ever wrongs each other, then these problems never show up. There is no existential on this. These may never occur. And so the idea is that if no one ever wrongs anyone else, this never actually occurs, and then there's the obligations never show up. So they could always prefer to be obligated not to do this, but if no one ever wrongs each other, that's the thing. And so there is no existential force behind this. And I kind of think that's part of the issue here. So, because these are specific people with obligations, but again, yeah, you'd still want the obligation to tell which person to do what. But is this, wait, WBA, let me look at this again. See, will be either. If a person, see, again, we've got some weird constructions in this. Will either be. So here, we've got the existential built in. There is this B right here. Yeah, this is, I think, again, some shenanigans. They will be. They had to get the existential in there. And so, again, that's what happened. They snuck the existential in right here. They couldn't just do it. So this is a universal for any person that will have a wronging. Such that there exists a wronging or being wronged by somebody else. And so this is part of the issue. Like, here's the existential right there. It's this. Boom. So, okay. I was just wondering where the existential was, because you still want that. You still want like the obligations to hold, but like these aren't necessarily like this isn't Infernal. How you doing? What's going on? I'm just finishing up. I'm losing my mind. There's some people who like try to use logic to make a point about the logic of obligation, and like they're very clever. This was actually pretty good, but like there's some subtle points in that. I've been trying to bang my head against it to figure out where they went wrong, and I finally found it. They snuck in the verb to be right over here. So it took a while, but I got there. I hope you're well. How'd the spooky game go? The first one was on semiotics, which was a request from Semiotics. So he likes semiotics, and so it was this extremely long paper that I don't normally read, but because it was a request, I did it for him, about the theory of signs. Yeah, so I mean, you can like go hear about Peirce's theory of signs. There's a whole 25 pages, which I don't normally read, on theory of signs, and then this one was about obligations and contradictory obligations. And so they're trying to show that the standard theory of obligations, the logic that we use of it, doesn't treat personal obligation right. It treats general obligations. When you're talking about like all the people, like what are we all obligated to do, it does that better than saying I'm obligated not to specifically do something to you. Again, like I said, it's subtle things, and maybe they're right about, like, I actually kind of agree that like it's an issue for the logic that it doesn't specify people very well, like individuals, but they still needed to like you can't, it's harder to do this stuff than people realize, even for highly skilled people, and I agree with what they were saying here, but they still had to sneak in an extra verb, an existential, to say this actually exists at this point. And I just got there right when you came in. I was like, bah, right there. I finally got it. Like, I finally found where they snuck in a little bit of something that wasn't in the stuff above it. So yeah, cool. I'm happy I had a good time. Yeah, I've been working on a new paper, and so I was doing that. Well, not a rewrite of an old paper, but I was doing that all day today. So I just lurked your stream a bit. But yeah, I'm all done. I'm spent at this point. The first paper killed me, and then this one was kind of a little bit of fun. I would have, maybe if I'd done this one first, I would have enjoyed it more. But like, I was like, where is this? There's too much logic and stuff. So yeah, I'm gonna have to duck out.